get into this. So there we go. There's my board. I'm going to go over a bunch of things from Unit 3 here. Just basically, I'm not going to rehash all the information from the various slideshows and stuff. I'm just going to kind of go over in general, maybe point out a few things, maybe have a little discussion, whatever. Write stuff on the whiteboard. You can see kind of like, a class. Anyway, I'll start with the first one, right? So GDP. So basically the measure of the output of the economy, the output of the country's economy, and it's used to basically say, is our economy, is it growing, is it increasing, or is it decreasing, right? So that's the main idea behind it. This is the most common measure used internationally. They used to have the gross national product, and you can look this stuff up yourself if you're interested, but basically the gross domestic product is more geared towards what happens within national borders, where the GNP will take into account stuff happening by foreign nationals outside of the borders of the country. There's more to it than that, basically. And for the most part, the GDP is higher, but in some cases, GNP can be higher based on what citizens are doing abroad versus what's going on at home. So one of the things, I don't know if you remember or paying attention, but Greece had a huge, and still has an issue, but it had a huge problem with its debt, right? And Germany put in told them if they wanted the money in the EU, they would have to put in lots of austerity measures, and that'd be lots of cuts, right? So when they did that, that meant that the GDP of the country, because GDP is like government spending and stuff as well, right? GDP went down, and the GNP was actually higher at that time in Greece, because people outside of Greece that were counted in the GNP, they might have been in a country that was doing better in terms of their economy than Greece, and therefore that's why it's not exactly a great measurement sometimes. It depends on what you're measuring. Sometimes it's not a great measurement just because of that. So Greece itself was, the economy was shrinking in a lot of respects, but the GNP was actually looking good and looking better than the GDP because of people outside of Greece that are counted as Greek citizens. So the next part I'm going to look at is, before I go to CPI, so GDP, right, there's the income and expenditure approaches. Again, you can look at the notes in the course. They have their drawbacks, lots of drawbacks, but some of the biggest ones is, what do we value, right? So some of the things, so like the black market is not included in that. That would also be like reciprocal trade. So that would be like, what? That's not what that word starts with. Like labor for labor deals, right? So a plumber works for someone to do electrical on a job that they have, something like that, where money doesn't change hands, things like that. Black market, of course, all sorts of things that can go on there, legitimate and illegitimate. It can go all the way from like yard sales to drugs and stuff like this. It's totally wide open. And then of course we were doing, right, the sharing economy, and the sharing economy doesn't always pop up very well in the GDP measurements either, just because of the various ways it works, and sometimes works in an informal basis. And now that there's more companies involved, there's more income being reported from it, but obviously not everything. And then the other thing is the value. So like leisure time, for instance, leisure and vacation, stuff like that, has no econ value depending on what you're talking about, but it's not measured in the GDP. But That doesn't mean that leisure isn't part of what you want to measure in terms of people's lives and stuff like that. So that's why that's also an omission when you come to measuring the effectiveness of a country's economy. Okay, so the next part is CPI. So CPI basically is a measurement of a basket of goods and how expensive they are from one year to the next. So this measures inflation, and it's based on a bunch of things. Now, what it does, though, like a bunch of things. You can look this up, but a lot of things that are deemed inflationary are not included on purpose because they're inflationary. So, cars and stuff like that. Sometimes they take some things out and they purposely avoid highly inflationary goods because it throws off the CPI measurement. But they might be things that people buy all the time. Other things I would point out, if you check it out on StatsCan, you can look at things like that they've changed in the basket of goods. So, for instance, I'm looking at the 2017, and they took out things for area rugs and mats because popularity. They took out things like this one, blank CDs and DVDs because people just don't buy those things anymore. And portable drives. These are all just things that were taken out of the basket of goods. They used to be something you'd measure because everybody was buying them, and then once it becomes clear that not enough people are buying them, they do update these boxes, right? Or these baskets, sorry. Like one that was added, for instance, is cannabis, right? Because legality and stuff like that had come into play, and so of course it's going to be lots of people are purchasing it. Therefore, you've got to measure it because it's not a highly inflationary good, and so you could measure the effects of inflation one year over the next using something like cannabis because of its rather stable price. But yeah, so CPI does have its drawbacks, right? It doesn't measure everything, but you can also, I'm going to bring in one other thing that you might see called COLA that you'll see when there's labor disputes and stuff like that. So that's cost of living allowance, right? And that basically means that every year, whatever group of people, their increase in pay would match the inflation rate, which is measured in part by CPI. So that's pay, what they call indexed to inflation. So I'm just going to point that one out because that one comes up quite a bit. Yeah, so that would mean like people would get a raise of, usually inflation has been somewhere in the neighborhood of 2%. It's been under 2%. That 2% is the target for the Bank of Canada. So it's usually in and around there. Sometimes it's higher, but most of the time it's not. Yeah, so that's kind of what you're talking about there. Okay, so what's next? Next, talking about the idea of fiscal policy and monetary policy. So the government, the goals of the government is for the economy to continue to grow and continue to provide jobs, right? Those are two of the big things that the government is tasked to do. And they have these tools at their disposal to do that. So, right, this is increase or decrease of government spending. And this is increase or decrease of what's called the overnight rate. And I'll come back to those things in a second. So the fiscal spending, right, this comes from John Maynard Keynes, and it's known as Keynesian economics. Basically, his idea, this is during the Great Depression and World War II, his idea is when the economy is down, you spend money to increase jobs and services, right? And then once these things increase enough, right, the economy will be back in a growth spot. So once it's doing well, you're supposed to lower spending and pay off debt. Now, that's not what happens anymore. Usually, increases in government spending, sometimes when they do have a big surplus, they do spend it. And then when they don't have that capacity for a spending, they put in austerity. So they're actually, a lot of the times, they're doing the opposite of what this theory says. Now, this doesn't mean this theory is right or wrong. But basically, when you have like a budget surplus as a government, which means the surplus means that your spending on programs is less than the amount you're bringing in through fees and taxes and all that kind of stuff. The Keynesian model would say you pay down the debt because that's when you have the extra money to do that, right? It's the same thing as if things are going well in your household. Your house payments are going well, all that kind of stuff. You're able to pay for all the things you have. You can take you can feed yourself. You can drive the car. All these things are working, and you're not going into debt to pay for your basic needs and stuff like that, and your daily kind of routine. That would mean you're in a surplus. So in terms of a personal choice, you should then, what should you do? You should pay down. Whoops. What? Why did I do that? Look at that. How magical is that? Pay down the mortgage is what people should do when they have that excess money. What do a lot of people do? Buy new something. Buy bigger something. Go on big trip. And again, I'm not saying that's necessary. Whoops, that looks like tip. That looks like big trip. Right. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying in terms of this theory, you're not kind of getting ahead of things, because eventually, your bills could go up, or you could lose your job or get a different job. You don't make as much money, whatever. There's lots of things that can happen in life, of course. And then you would have to rely on getting a loan or something like that to do certain things. And if you'd already paid off other debts, you'd have more capacity to do that. Whereas if you hadn't, and you just spent more, when it comes time to tighten the belt, I guess you have to. Now, the opposite part of that, the austerity part, when you don't have money, austerity, they say, you don't, and this comes from like the Great Depression kind of thinking and other thinking, but like austerity, they basically like no money, cut spending, right? The only problem with that is this, it doesn't stimulate, doesn't stimulate growth, right? So basically it doesn't do anything positive for the economy. In some cases it might shrink the economy because, this might be like layoffs for people with good jobs, and then people with good jobs can spend money in the economy, but if they lose a job, they can't, and therefore you're going to be stuck in austerity measures because people can't spend money in the economy. Nobody's opening new businesses because nobody's spending money, so on and so forth. So anyway, these are just arguments that can be made one way or the other. Other people, right, austerity measures are put in so you can pay down the debt that the previous government or whatever didn't do. Anyway, there's lots of thought around this, and I'm not trying to tell you one way is better than the other. I'm just pointing it out. Now, the other part, and so, sorry, as a contemporary thing, so if you look at like right now, right, that is not as, I apologize for my writing, by the way. It's not much better in person. So with COVID-19, spending way up, right, through the roof. Spending is through the roof because they're trying to keep money in the hands of consumers. They want like consumption or consumer spending to at least remain static, if not go up. They definitely don't want it to fall too much, because that would cost, businesses would disappear, just like restaurants are obviously struggling, things like that. But eventually, this increase in spending is going to lead to an increase in taxes or a decrease in services, right? So once this is finished, we're going to see one of two ways of going. It depends on the government's choice and which government you're talking about. Some governments will go here, they'll go to austerity, and that will be the reduction of services, which is what we saw in this province before this hit, right? There's lots of, they're talking about lots of cuts and everything like that to pay for things. And then the other option here is increase in taxes, and I think the NDP would probably be in favor of that, but that's a pretty unpopular one because most people don't vote to raise their taxes, even if it makes sense to raise taxes because you have to pay for things, and a lot of people don't want to pay the bill, right? You eat your steak, you eat your, whatever meal it is, I don't know, whatever your expensive meal is, and then the bill comes, you're like, wow, if I'd known it was this much, I wouldn't have ordered it, whatever, right? You already have to, you have to pay your bill. So there's other ways. Maybe the next time you go out, you just, you eat bread and water. Okay, that's austerity. Or in the other case, if you don't do that, then you continue to at least get a reasonable meal, and the person that you're paying to make the meal and everything, they come to your store, they buy stuff like that. That's the general idea, obviously boiled down to quite a simple example, but that is the general idea. Okay, moving on. So where am I? Monetary policy, right here. There's a bad boy right there. So monetary policy, that is the Bank of Canada. And the Bank of Canada has quarterly reports. In the States, they call them the Fed for short. That's not, obviously it's not the Bank of Canada down there. But the Fed is usually what you hear about doing their quarterly report. And they basically say, they come out and say, we're going to increase or decrease, right, the interest rate. And what that's actually doing, so the Bank of Canada loans to banks, right? So the Bank of Canada is setting the interest rate on these loans. So whatever the overnight rate is, right, that's the amount of money that a bank has to pay to get to get money from the Bank of Canada, and then they turn around and then they loan it. So when they get loans to the banks, then the banks loan to their clients, right? So that's both individual and that's businesses. Okay, so in theory, I'm just going to do bus, that's business. So in theory, when the Bank of Canada lowers the interest rate, that means that money should be cheaper because the bank is spending less here and therefore should be able to offer more competitive rates here. That's the idea behind monetary policy. If you want people to spend money, so the other thing that comes into play here is the inflation rate, and this is one of the big things that they use to control the inflation rate. If you increase the money in the economy, you're increasing the inflation rate, right? If you decrease money, you decrease the inflation rate, right? So the cheaper money is, the more it is available, right? The more people are going to spend, the more inflation jumps up. You want to think of a historical example of that. When the Spanish Empire was taking tons and tons of gold and silver out of South America especially, they didn't have economic measures. Economics was not a field that was sophisticated enough to handle all of that influx of precious metals to be used as spending. And so Spain, while at the height of its power, right, as a global power, quickly fell, and one of the biggest things, I mean, they lost wars too, and that kind of stuff happens, and instability. But one of the big things is that their economy was swamped with silver, and this happened to China too at the same time as all this European silver would arrive in, I think it was Ming China, and basically it devalued the currency so much that inflation or prices rose quickly. Another example of this is if you look at post World War I Germany. You've probably heard of the hyperinflation that happened after. Basically, people had their life savings, let's say just as a number, they had 1,000,000 marks in the bank, and bread, at the beginning of the day, bread could have been 50,000 marks for bread, which would have been ridiculous. But 50,000 marks for bread, and at the end of the day, it could have jumped up, to 200,000 marks for a loaf of bread. So people's life savings were quickly eliminated, and the value of the mark was just nothing, because what the German government did is they printed more money to pay the French reparations, right? So they had to pay the French for the First World War as part of the Versailles Treaty. That was their solution, and that involved led to hyperinflation. It also happened to Greece and the drachma before the European Union, and in Italy, the lira. Those were not basically worthless, but they're very devalued. Same thing as in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, I think it's Zimbabwean dollar, I think. Next to worthless, right? So their economy uses basically American dollars because their money is so useless because of the economic policies of the previous government, the dictator that was there for quite a while, Mugabe. Anyway, I could go on, lots of different examples. You're like, why are you still talking about this? Anyway, point being, if I can go way back to it, this is the way this is the way it should happen, but it's not necessarily going to happen. So what's going to happen is sometimes the Bank of Canada lowers the interest rate and makes it cheaper for banks to get money, and then they don't pass it on to their customers. And basically then the bank is just increasing its own profits, right? And that's happened before too. That happened in 2000, after 2008. Which for various reasons was completely a nefarious thing for them to do, but whatever. Anyway, that's the idea, is that to stimulate the economy, you get people spending by making money cheaper to acquire. So it's cheaper to get a loan, cheaper to buy a house because you're paying less in interest. Like right now, again with the COVID, I think the overnight rate is like 1/4%, something like that. It's very low, so that means it's very cheap to spend money to get loans because you have very little to pay back, in terms of interest. At the inverse of that, of course, the cheaper it is to get a loan, the more difficult it is to get a stable investment, because the interest rate is so low that things like bonds and savings accounts have next to no interest value. So those stable ones, if you want to make money in like money markets and stuff like that, you have to go with riskier investments. So those are just things that happen because of monetary policy. Okay, I have one other thing. That I'm going to talk about. I know if anybody's actually still listening, thank you, first of all. Secondly, I'm sure there's a bit of cheering going. Oh, good, he's finally finished speaking. Now you know what it's like being in my class, by the way, when they're finally like, oh my gosh, is he going to shut up or what? And the answer is usually no. Well, anyway. We'll see. So, talking about labor, right, and labor economics. So, basically, the labor market works, we have the whole supply and demand kind of curves the same way. It's the exact same thing for labor market, except for prices and stuff. We're talking about the wages that are offered, and therefore the amount or hours could be measured in a lot of things. I'll just put in hours. So basically the price and the supply, so workers are supplying their labor, their hours, and the price they are demanding is the wages. Inversely, the company is offering wages, and they want a certain amount of output or a certain amount of hours for it. So the equilibrium here is where both parties are like, yeah, okay, basically, I will work for that. Okay, so that's the idea behind like the labor market. Is very similar to the regular market for anything else. There are lots of things that can change how that works, and again, you can go through the note on it. One of the biggest things in Canada that's different than the United, well, there's a lot of things different in Canada and the United States, but one of the things in terms of labor and stuff like that, in terms of unions, is what we have. It's called the RAND Act, or the RAND formula. And basically that means so because of this RAND formula, if there's a union, oh, actually, hold on, let me talk about this a little different way. Basically, the RAND formula makes it so the employer remits dues on behalf of the union. Okay. Why is that such a big deal? That's a big deal because in that way you cannot, as an individual, you cannot withhold dues. Right? So if you're in the union, you get a job that has a union. So for instance, like a teacher, I can't not pay my union dues. The employer collects and remits that on my behalf. I never actually see that money. It's gone by the time I get my paycheck. That's gone, just like income tax and stuff, and CPP and all those things that get taken off your income. It's done immediately, and what that does is it prevents union busting techniques that try and convince people that, hey, you deserve that money that you're paying to the union. And people who are going to go along with it are much more likely to go along with it because they think, yeah, if I had an extra $50 every time I got paid, I could do this or I could do that or whatever it is. In the long run, probably not the best idea because the union takes care of a lot of different things for them, including higher wages and maintaining hours, stuff like that. So it's just a way for to protect against union busting. In the U.S., they put in something called the did that backwards, but they did the right to work legislation, which is what a great name, but not what it is. So right to work basically said that you can refuse to pay your union dues. You don't have to choose to be a union member, right? You can choose not to be a union member. The only thing this did in right to work states is it drove down, that is not a dollar sign, I'm going to write the word, it drove down wages, and it allows something called like shift bids, which you're like, well, it's fine. Whoever wants the job or whoever wants it can do it. But all this does is that a shift bid basically says, hey, I need somebody to work, tomorrow for 8 hours. And someone says, well, I'll do it for $20 an hour. And the next person says, well, I'll do it for $19 an hour, $18 an hour. So all you're doing is you just continue down that path and you're just lowering your wages. So it's basically ends up being, what did I do there? Okay, I wonder if anybody actually knew what that word was. That ends up being a race to the bottom, right? Because all you're going to do is bottom out your wages as people compete for work on a basis. It's ultimate in terms of free market. Sure, it's great, but it doesn't provide any protection from corporations and stuff. They're just going to rake in the money, extra money, and it's not unlike, again, you can look this stuff up, but the whole idea of trickle-down economics during Reaganomics during Ronald Reagan's presidency, that stuff does not work because the money never comes back to the worker, to the public. It just goes into the corporation and goes to the shareholders, right? So things that are sold in that way, the numbers are in. That does not actually work in terms of that. The last thing I was going to talk about is the idea of full employment, which you can, again, it's in the notes, but full employment, right, does not equal 0% unemployment. That's not possible because of the way that things work in the real world. So people move, change jobs, right? Go to school. There's all sorts of things that people do that they're going to change, that they're not going to always be in the same job or in a job. There's also seasonal work, right? So you can't pick grapes in the Niagara region in December. I don't think you can. I don't know. I can't remember when the ice wine grapes are picked, but I'm pretty sure it's still not in December because that seems ridiculous. You can do this, of course, in greenhouses, but on a large scale, you just can't do certain jobs seasonally, out of season, right? You're not going to work in too many of the arenas during the summertime because a lot of the arenas take the ice out. Some still go. Other ones take the ice out, cost saving measures. You just can't work in certain industries out of season. People don't go to Canada's Wonderland. It's closed in, October. You can't go. So you can't work there either, right? So there are the idea of seasonal work. Where you get into a real problem, what they really want to avoid is sometimes is structural, or if worse is chronic unemployment. And that is more people that, right, they can't find any steady work. The unemployment rate basically works on aggregates and looking at these different factors. But if you have like a structural problem in your unemployment, where people just aren't getting jobs in certain jobs are not appearing or anything like that, or there's no movement in certain labor markets, then you really have problems, right? So it's these things that are a problem. That's just the way it goes. These are problems. And then hopefully everybody, I forgot to mention this earlier, but hopefully everybody's seen the business cycle, right? The whole idea, you can call these things different things all you want. It's fine. Bust, trough. Can't read them anyway because I can't write. Boom or peak. You've got expansion and recession. This could also be depression, but basically the whole idea here is the economy it tracks along this line, right? Goes up, it might go way up here, and then it might crash suddenly, and then it'll come back gradually over time, and it might fall and then go, like, you just don't know, right? So it could, like I said, it could do this. There's all sorts of ones. People seem to think it just does this. Everything's just great. And then when the other part happens, people think it just does this. It doesn't do that. Right? It might do that. You might have this here, but eventually the opposite is going to happen because you can't maintain. If you're working at full employment, for instance, let's say you are at full employment. Full employment, basically not only do you need workers, but you need the machines, you need supply, right? You need raw materials, this is all depending on what it is you're talking about, but you need all these things to be working. And if something, like let's say you're in like a lumber business, or you're like making furniture, and you don't have any wood, right? Or there's a shortage one month, well, you're not, like, this is not going to happen. It can't happen forever. So eventually something changes, whether it's weather related, whether it's a cash flow thing, or whether it's a political thing or a pandemic thing, or whatever it is. Something always derails a perfect situation in terms of economics. And at the same time, eventually things recover. It's just how long does it take? And that's when you have those, right? This fiscal and the monetary policies, they're not to do this all the time. That's not going to work. What it is that they want, so if things are going up, great. They know they're going to come down. They want to avoid this. That's terrible. People lose jobs, all that kind of stuff. What they want to do is they want to stretch out that lowering as much as they can before it starts to go up again. This is going to happen. Down is going to happen. But they want to smooth it out as much as possible. And if things are going down like this, they want to smooth out the bottom, right? The soft landing, or whatever you want to call it. That's the ultimate goal in terms of fiscal and monetary policy and governments in general when it comes to the economy. Anyway, hopefully you got something out of me babbling, talking, and already enjoy the rest of whatever you're doing. Bye-bye.